Emily never imagined her life would change so drastically in just a single moment. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when she stepped out of the small bookstore where she worked part-time. The chilly air nipped at her cheeks as she wrapped her scarf tighter and began her walk home through the quiet streets of her small town. Emily was a creature of habit. Her life followed a predictable rhythm, one that she had come to rely on after years of uncertainty. But that night, something felt different. As she crossed the dimly lit park, she noticed a faint, distant sound, a melody, haunting yet beautiful, carried softly by the wind. She stopped, her breath visible in the cold air, straining to identify the source. It wasn't uncommon for street musicians to play in the park, but this song was unlike anything she'd ever heard. It pulled at her, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Against her better judgment, Emily followed the sound, her curiosity overpowering the small voice in her head, urging her to turn back. The music grew louder as she ventured deeper into the park, the lights from the street fading behind her. Her heart raced as she rounded a bend and saw a figure sitting under an old oak tree. A man, his face obscured by shadows, was playing a violin with such emotion that it felt as though the world itself had paused to listen. Emily hesitated, her instincts warning her to leave, but something in the way he played rooted her to the spot. Then, as if sensing her presence, the man stopped abruptly and turned his head toward her. His piercing eyes locked onto hers, and Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Before she could muster the courage to speak, he lowered his violin and asked in a voice that was both gentle and unnerving, "Why have you come here?" Emily opened her mouth to reply, but found no words. The man stood, his silhouette towering in the faint moonlight. "You shouldn't have followed the music," he said, his tone heavy with a warning. "It wasn't meant for you." "What do you mean?" Emily finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. But before he could answer, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the park, scattering leaves and drowning out his reply. The next thing she knew, the man was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. Emily was left standing alone, the silence pressing in around her. She looked down and noticed something glinting at her feet, a small, ornate key that hadn't been there moments before. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, its intricate design unlike anything she'd ever seen. Questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Whatever she had stumbled upon that night, it was only the beginning. And as she turned to leave the park, clutching the key tightly, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to take a turn she wasn't prepared for. Emily's steps echoed faintly on the pavement as she left the park, the key clenched tightly in her hand. The night felt heavier now, the usual warmth of a small town replaced by an unsettling chill. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man with the violin appear behind her. But the streets were empty, and only the sound of distant traffic broke the silence. Back at her tiny apartment, Emily placed the key on her kitchen table, staring at it as if it might reveal its secrets. The design was unlike anything she'd ever seen, intricate swirls and engravings running along its surface. In the center of the bow was a small emblem, a symbol she didn't recognize but couldn't look away from. It seemed ancient, as though it belonged to a time long forgotten. She ran her fingers over the cold metal, a strange sense of familiarity nagging at her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her best friend, Claire. *, "You okay? You seemed distracted at work today." Emily hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. How could she explain what had just happened? She decided against replying, tossing her phone aside and returning her attention to the key. Questions filled her mind. Who was that man? Why did he seem so intent on her leaving? And why did it feel like the key wasn't just a coincidence? Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something far bigger than herself, something she didn't fully understand yet. As the hours crept by, her unease only deepened. She decided she couldn't just ignore it. Grabbing her coat, she resolved to find out where the key belonged, even if it meant risking everything. Emily stepped out into the quiet night, the cold air biting at her face as she tucked the key into her pocket. The streets were nearly deserted, but the faint hum of life from distant houses and shops reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. Her instincts told her to turn back, to leave the mystery of the key behind and return to her predictable, safe routine. But something stronger, something she couldn't quite name, kept her moving forward. She found herself walking toward the library. It wasn't much, just a small brick building that had stood in town for decades, but it had always been a place she turned to when she needed answers. Maybe it wouldn't have anything on an old key or mysterious violin music, but it was a start. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the warm scent of old books and dust greeted her. The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, looked up from her desk with a welcoming smile. "Emily, it's late," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice soft but curious. "What brings you here at this hour?" I need to look something up," Emily replied, hesitating. She wasn't sure how much to reveal. Pulling the key from her pocket, she showed it to Mrs. Hargrove. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" The librarian's expression shifted as she leaned closer, her smile fading into something more serious. She adjusted her glasses, studying the key carefully. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her tone quieter now. Emily faltered. I found it," she said vaguely. "Why? Does it mean something?" Mrs. Hargrove didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a thick book behind her desk, its cover worn and cracked with age. She flipped through its pages until she stopped at an illustration that made Emily's breath catch. It was a perfect match to her key, down to the smallest detail. "This isn't just any key," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's connected to something ancient, something people stopped talking about long ago. But if you found it—" She paused, looking at Emily with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You might not have found it by accident." Emily's heart raced as she stared at the book. The page mentioned words she didn't understand, something about an artifact, a forgotten doorway, and a warning. Before she could ask more, a loud thud echoed from the back of the library, making both women jump. "Is someone else here?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. Mrs. Hargrove frowned, glancing toward the darkened shelves. "Not that I know of." The uneasy silence that followed was quickly broken by another thud, louder this time, closer. Emily instinctively stepped back, clutching the key in her hand. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew that whatever was happening now was connected to the strange events of the night. And for the first time, she wondered if she'd made a mistake by not turning back. Emily's pulse quickened as the thuds grew louder, reverberating through the quiet library. The dim light from the overhead fixtures cast long shadows over the rows of shelves, making the space feel far larger and more foreboding than it had moments ago. Mrs. Hargrove stood frozen, her hand gripping the edge of the desk as she strained to listen. "I'll check the back," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. "No," Emily blurted out, stepping forward. "Let me go with you." She didn't know why she offered. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to stay rooted where she was, but something about the situation felt too big to face alone. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated before nodding, and together they moved cautiously toward the noise. The rows of books seemed to stretch endlessly, the air growing colder the farther they walked. Each step felt heavier, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. As they reached the farthest corner of the library, the source of the noise became clear. A wooden door, one Emily had never noticed before, stood slightly ajar. Its edges were carved with the same intricate patterns she had seen on the key, and a faint, eerie light pulsed from within. "Do you know where this leads?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Mrs. Hargrove shook her head, her expression unreadable. "That door has always been locked. No one's had a key for it. Until now." Emily's hand instinctively moved to her pocket, fingers closing around the cold metal. She glanced at Mrs. Hargrove, who gave her a silent nod. Slowly, Emily pulled the key out and held it up, its engraved surface catching the strange light from beyond the door. A deep, resonant hum filled the air as the key seemed to pulse in her hand. Emily took a shaky breath and stepped closer, unsure if she was being drawn to the door or if she was walking toward it of her own free will. The light from the gap intensified as she reached for the handle. Just as her fingers brushed the cold metal, the door creaked open wider on its own, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest. "What's down there?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the noise. "I don't know," Mrs. Hargrove admitted, though her tone suggested she might have an idea. "But if this is what I think it is, you're standing at the edge of something that's been hidden for centuries." Before Emily could reply, the light from the staircase flickered, and a cold wind swept through the library, extinguishing every light overhead. In the pitch black, Emily heard the door behind her slam shut, sealing them in. A deep voice, one that seemed to come from the very air around them, echoed through the darkness. "You were warned not to follow." Emily gripped the key tightly, realizing too late that whatever she had unlocked, there was no turning back. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the voice echoed through the darkness, each word reverberating like it had come from the walls themselves. She turned instinctively toward Mrs. Hargrove, but she could barely make out the older woman's silhouette in the faint glow still emanating from the staircase. "Who said that?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Hargrove didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to Emily, her expression barely visible but unmistakably fearful. "I don't know," she said finally, though the tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. "But if that door is what I think it is, we may have disturbed something best left alone." The words chilled Emily more than the cold air now swirling around them. The door behind them wouldn't budge no matter how hard they pushed, trapping them in the oppressive darkness. The only way forward was down the staircase, where the light flickered erratically like a dying flame. Reluctantly, Emily stepped onto the first stair, clutching the key as though it might somehow protect her. Each step creaked underfoot, the sound amplified in the silence. Mrs. Hargrove followed close behind, her breath quick and shallow. The hum that had filled the air earlier grew louder again, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. As they descended, the staircase opened into a cavernous room illuminated by an otherworldly glow. The walls were lined with massive carvings, their patterns eerily similar to those on the key. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested an object that drew Emily's gaze immediately. A second key, this one larger and pulsing faintly with light. Emily took a cautious step forward, but Mrs. Hargrove's hand shot out, gripping her arm. "Wait," she said urgently. "This isn't just about finding out where that key leads. That pedestal, it's a warning." Before Emily could ask what she meant, the hum turned into a low growl, and the room seemed to shift. Shadows began to form along the edges, twisting and stretching until they resembled figures. One by one, they stepped into the faint light, their eyes glowing faintly as they fixed their gaze on Emily. "Who are they?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're the Guardians," Mrs. Hargrove replied grimly. "They protect what's hidden here. And if you've come this far, they think you're a threat." Emily's grip tightened around the key as the figures moved closer, their forms flickering like they weren't entirely solid. She tried to back away, but the pedestal pulsed brightly, drawing her attention back to the second key. It was as though it was calling to her, demanding she take it. But before she could move, the ground beneath them shook violently, and a voice, louder and more commanding than the one before, boomed through the chamber. "You cannot take what is not yours. Choose wisely, or face the consequences." Emily's heart pounded as she realized she was at the center of something far bigger than she could have imagined, with no clear way out and no idea who, or what, to trust. Emily froze, her heart hammering in her chest as the glowing figures circled closer. The deep voice echoed again, shaking the very air around her. "The key you hold opens more than doors. It binds, it frees, and it decides. But you must prove you are worthy." The pedestal's glow grew stronger, casting long shadows across the chamber. The second key seemed to pulse in time with Emily's heartbeat, beckoning her forward. Mrs. Hargrove tugged on her arm, her voice urgent. "Don't do it, Emily. Whatever power this place holds, it's not meant for us. You don't know what it will unleash." Emily stared at the pedestal, torn between fear and an inexplicable pull she couldn't ignore. The Guardians' forms flickered again, their movements growing sharper, more deliberate. One stepped forward, raising an arm that stretched unnaturally toward her. Emily stumbled back, her foot catching on uneven ground. She fell, the key in her hand skidding across the stone floor toward the pedestal. The chamber trembled violently, and the second key's glow intensified, flooding the room with blinding light. Emily shielded her eyes as a sharp, piercing sound filled the air. When the light dimmed, the Guardians were frozen, their glowing eyes fixed on her. The deep voice returned, softer now, almost contemplative. "You did not take what was not yours. You allowed the key to choose." Confusion swirled in Emily's mind as she pushed herself to her feet. The second key floated slightly above the pedestal, its light now calm, almost inviting. "What does this mean?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Mrs. Hargrove stepped forward cautiously. "It's acknowledging you," she said, her voice tinged with both awe and fear. "But why? What have you done to earn this?" Before Emily could respond, the voice spoke again. "The key was hidden to protect the balance. Many sought it for power, but only one who seeks truth and carries no greed may wield it. The choice was never yours. It was the key's." The second key floated toward Emily, hovering just inches from her outstretched hand. She hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Hargrove, who nodded faintly. Taking a deep breath, Emily grasped the key. The chamber instantly transformed, the carvings along the walls glowing in intricate patterns as if unlocking secrets long buried. But then the ground beneath them rumbled again, this time more violently. The frozen Guardians dissolved into shadows, retreating into the walls as the deep voice returned, stern and urgent. "Balance has been disturbed. You have the key, but you must restore what was broken." "What does that mean?" Emily shouted, panic creeping into her voice. The glow from the carvings converged into a single beam of light, pointing toward another door at the far end of the chamber. Emily felt the second key grow warm in her hand, its pull unmistakable. She realized this wasn't over. Whatever she had started, the real challenge lay ahead. As Emily and Mrs. Hargrove rushed toward the door, the ground split behind them, a chasm opening where the pedestal had stood. Just as they crossed the threshold, Emily glanced back one last time, the enormity of what lay ahead sinking in. She had the key, but she was no longer sure if it was a gift, a burden, or something far more dangerous. Emily stumbled through the door, clutching the second key tightly in her hand. Behind her, the rumbling subsided, and an eerie stillness filled the air. She and Mrs. Hargrove found themselves in a small, circular chamber bathed in soft light. Unlike the ominous carvings from before, the walls here were smooth and unmarked, radiating a strange sense of calm. At the center of the room stood a simple stone table. Upon it was a hollow slot, perfectly shaped to hold both keys. Emily hesitated, her breath unsteady. She turned to Mrs. Hargrove, searching for answers. "It's up to you now," Mrs. Hargrove said quietly, her usual confidence tempered by the weight of the moment. "This is the choice the voice spoke of. Whatever you do, you need to trust your instincts." Emily stared at the slot, her mind racing. She thought of the pedestal's warning, the glowing figures, and the chaos she had just witnessed. It wasn't about power, she realized. It was about balance, restoring what had been broken, not taking anything for herself. With steady hands, she placed both keys into the slot. A faint hum filled the chamber, growing into a harmonious melody. The walls glowed softly, and for a moment, Emily felt an overwhelming peace. The keys dissolved into light, the patterns along the walls shimmering before fading entirely. The air grew still, and a sense of finality settled over the room. "It's done," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice soft. Emily exhaled deeply, the weight of the experience finally lifting. As they exited the chamber, the library seemed unchanged, as if none of it had ever happened. But Emily knew better. The keys had chosen her for a reason, and while she didn't fully understand it yet, she felt a quiet resolve. Some mysteries, she realized, aren't meant to be solved all at once. Walking back into the night, Emily glanced at the now ordinary library door behind her. The echoes of what she had faced lingered in her mind, but so did a newfound strength. Life would return to its usual rhythm, but she carried a piece of the experience within her, a reminder that even the most ordinary lives can be part of something extraordinary.